a little bit organize Professor Herzfeld's visit here to Coimbra. Today's lecture is titled "The Minion in Disguise, the Dynamics of Crypto-Colonialism Then and Now." This is an initiative of the research group Technoscience, Society and Environment of the CIAS, Center for Research in Anthropology and Health, of the University of Coimbra, in cooperation with the CEIS 20, the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies of the 20th Century at the University of Coimbra, as well as with the Department of Life Sciences at Coimbra and the Interdisciplinary Research Institute. And finally, also in collaboration with the research network SciTech 8, which is an international network chaired by Professor Sanders. I am very glad to present today Professor Michael Herzfeld of Harvard University. Professor Herzfeld is Ernest E. Monrad Research Professor of the Social Sciences in the Department of Anthropology at Harvard University. He is the author of 12 books. The two most recent are Siege of the Spirits, Community and Polity in Bangkok, published in 2016, and Subversive Archaism, Troubling Traditionalists and the Politics of National Heritage, published in 2021. He is also the author of 2 films, Monty Moments of 2007, and Roman Restaurant Rhythms of 2011, which some of you had the pleasure of seeing yesterday and discussing with Professor Herzfeld. He is, of course, also the author of numerous articles, too many to list here, and reviews. He is a member of the editorial boards of American Ethnologist, Ethnologie Française, and the International Journal of Heritage Studies and several other journals. In particular, he has served as an editor of American Ethnologist and is currently editor-at-large of the Anthropological Quarterly. His work has been or is being translated into many languages: Bulgarian, Catalan, Chinese, French, German, Greek, Italian, Japanese, Korean, Polish, Portuguese, Serbian, Spanish, and Vietnamese. And he lectures and publishes directly in French, Greek, Italian, and Thai, in addition to English. Michael, it's a real pleasure once again to listen to you and to listen to your research. And we are all looking forward to this lecture and to talking with you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And very happy to be here, and I appreciate people coming in at the end of a long day. And I wish I could give you this talk in Portuguese. And it's not yet one of my languages. I'm working on it. If I suddenly slip into Thai, you will certainly probably look rather mystified, and I hope I will notice it in time and switch back to English. My English is not bad, or so I'm told. So let me introduce this talk simply by giving some definitions. So why do we need another term? We already have post-colonialism, neo-colonialism, semi-colonialism, colonialism tout court. We have all sorts of colonialisms. Why do we need another one? Well, this is really a category that speaks to the most, I would say, the most dishonest form of colonialism, which absolutely refuses to admit that it's any form of colonialism at all, and yet has effects that can be as damaging, in some ways more damaging than direct colonialism. As I said to my class this morning, some of you I hope will remember this, I am a great believer in the comparative force of anthropology and history, and also that I also believe that comparison is most effective when it's really outrageous. You want to shock people into understanding that there are connections you can make that are not obvious. And as you will hear, I'm going to talk a lot about Greece and Thailand, 2 countries I know very well. no, people don't normally put them in the same category. So I am offending against a certain kind of conventional academic propriety, but I'm doing it quite deliberately. And what I want to try to explain is how crypto-colonialism, and we'll talk about what that really is in a moment, traps certain countries in a situation where they can't protest about the evils of colonialism because they've been boasting for far too long that they were never colonized, even though everyone knows it isn't really true, or at least it's only true in a very limited sense. We have a lot of colonialisms, and some people have thought that semi-colonialism, which is often applied, for example, to Thailand, would cover all the cases, and you'll see in a moment there are many of them, that I consider to belong to crypto-colonialism. Now, I am not interested in a taxonomic war. I don't want to fight out an argument about what is this kind of colonialism or that colonialism, or whether this or that country does or does not fit. Those are boring questions. The interesting question is, what do we gain by using such a category, and what might we lose by using such a category? That's a much more dynamic question that, to me, allows us to think more productively. Now, there are some common themes, and some of them are deep historical themes, and that's partly why I added to the title, almost as an afterthought, the words then and now. Because these countries are characterized by a deep resentment of what we generally call the West, and that resentment has long historical roots. Think, for example, of the relationship between Germany, always a prominent part of the Western European power structure, even though when Greece became a nation state, Germany was still a collection of very small states, and not really nation states in the modern sense at all. And yet Germany has always been able to bully Greece. They've done it to Portugal as well, but not, I think, as massively as in the Greek case. And they've bullied them in all sorts of ways, from outright invasion during the Nazi period to extraordinary mistreatment of Greece in the context of the European Union. Again, my students are already aware of one case where, for example, the German energy companies are extracting, and that's a word you associate with colonialism, extracting clean energy from villages that are thereby left without their own sources of energy, and because partly also they've been deprived of their fields, which are now full of voltaic cells. The Germans export the clean energy back to Germany, the villagers burn wood and thereby further deplete their environment and also pollute it. And this has been described locally as a form of colonialism. More dangerously in the long term, the Germans have always said that the Greeks were a perfect example of the Aryan race. Now, that idea reached its apogee in the Nazi period, and it's a very pernicious idea. There's no such thing as an Aryan race. There are languages that are classified as Indo-European, and the word Aryan is sometimes applied to them. But just to give you an idea of how widespread these ideas are, one Thai word, you're going to get some Thai after all, for civilization is Aryatam, which is Arya, Aryan, Dharma, righteousness. So there you have it. And even in Sri Lanka, the Sinhala, in order to justify their repression of the Tamil disadvantaged minority, will invoke the myth of Aryan origins for the Sinhala people. So this went far beyond the borders of Germany, but in the relationship between Germany and Greece, it was peculiarly toxic because they could say, well, you don't look like the ancient Greeks, and in a while you're going to see why they don't look like the ancient Greeks. It's not race, it's because of how they were represented by the Germans. And so this myth of Hellenic purity and the failure, quote unquote, of the Greeks to measure up to it became a fundamental problem. Now, not all of the countries I list as crypto-colonial have been bullied by the Germans, but this gives you a very good example of how culture is weaponized against particular countries. I don't like talking about nation states. I think that term is now out of date. I want to talk about bureaucratic ethnonational states. I know it's a bigger mouthful, but what has happened in the last 50 or 100 years is that states that began, and the USA is a good example of this, as places where citizenship was a matter of a formal bureaucratic procedure and did not pay attention to your ethnic origins, has moved into something much more pernicious, namely states that are dominated by an ethnic majority. And some of them start out that way, like Israel, for example, which is dominated by a single ethnic majority. Greece certainly also started out that way, and there is a new publication by a Greek and an Israeli archaeologist who take a very critical stand about the role of archaeology in constructing this kind of identity, and use the model of crypto-colonialism to discuss it. So what we're talking about is states that have been induced to become increasingly ethnically defined, and what is interesting is that the model for that is entirely the model of colonial and now post-colonial states that are, in a sense, following in a track created for them by the colonial powers, and from which there's very little escape. So this is why you see across the world more and more nation states becoming dominated by a single ethnic group that then came to be the only representative of civilization in the country. So what are crypto-colonies? Well, the first and most important thing is that they were proclaimed independent. They always say, never colonize. Every one of these countries seems to have a phrase, a Thai form. The Greeks will simply talk about eleftheria, their freedom, and so on. And importantly, these countries were also excluded from what I rather unkindly call the post-colonial grumbling club, because they can't complain. They've been boasting for so long that they were free states that therefore they have no right now to say we suffered as much from colonialism. In some ways they suffered more, but they can't talk about it. They have continued to entertain societies, I say, based on personal connections. In other words, patronage remains extremely important in defiance of a top-down definition of democracy. This is an inbuilt or locked-in failure in the eyes of the Western powers, and it's one of the things that allows the Western powers to continue to treat these countries as in some way inferior. They encase within set borders, and countries don't necessarily have borders. We come to think of them as having borders. This is part of the historical backdrop. A homogeneous definition of national culture. Now, every anthropologist today will tell you there's no such thing as a culture. And it's a construct, it's an imaginary construct. Culture exists as a process. Culture exists as what we all learn, and culture is a very fluid and flexible and malleable phenomenon. And this idea of a national culture is like a shield, so that you can't actually see what's going on behind that facade, what I call cultural intimacy. The things we all know, including the fact that our culture is not static. Many of these countries are or were ruled by hereditary monarchies, and often these monarchies are constructed as extensions of a monastic order of some sort. They were always concerned with the security of borders, even though the borders themselves are modern inventions. And we see this in a long history that becomes very intense in recent years because of the Cold War. Now, all of the battles over migration, Thailand and Greece are both at the center of different sets of massive migrations, and of course, migration badly handled, and that deliberately badly handled, will trigger racist responses. And by the way, racism is not a privilege of the Europeans alone, so we see plenty of it in Thailand. And they restrict the movement of minorities, even of those minorities that have been there for a very long time, in many cases for many centuries. Moreover, they also reproduce internally the concealed colonialism of their own condition. So they then colonize some of their more outlying provinces or neighboring small countries Greece and Turkey, Turkey is another crypto colony, has certainly done that with Cyprus. The Thai state has done this with its own, it actually absorbed a northern kingdom called Lanao, meaning 1,000 fields, and more recently also Iceland, which is the northeast province, which they regard as Lao-speaking and therefore not quite Thai enough. And of course the south, which is Muslim and therefore becomes an object of an increasingly ethno-national and religious intolerance. And Nepal has similar interests in Bhutan. You're going to find, although they haven't been able to do much about it, you're going to find it very surprising that I have Iceland on my list of crypto colonies, and even more surprising that the Icelanders seem to have colonial ambitions in the Faroe Islands. So I could go on and on, but the examples proliferate. So they're reproducing their own condition toward subordinate populations. So here's a list, it's not exhaustive, but what I've done here is to give you the countries and then the places that seem to be the object of this reproduction of the colonial relationship. Iran is a very clear case of crypto-colonialism. They have ambitions to take over the, after all, fundamentally Persian-speaking Kurdish populations in Turkey and Iraq, and that's part of what's driving a lot of the tension there right now. In Ethiopia, the current civil war is all about a group of people who don't speak Amharic, they speak Tigranic, and they are predominantly Muslim in a predominantly Christian, Coptic Orthodox country. So there, again, there's a similar kind of relationship. In Afghanistan, I would say that the attempt to create a unified state has failed very largely. And it may well be that the Taliban are actually achieving what no one else has been able to achieve because they understand very well the nature of what, for those of you who are technically interested in anthropology, are segmentary tribal organizations. China, in its attitude to Hong Kong and Taiwan, as well as to its internal minorities, is doing the same thing. And also the Chinese have developed a national genome project, the whole purpose of which is to prove that all the minorities are actually thinly disguised Han Chinese. There you have it. Now, I'm going to take up my primary examples, Thailand and Greece, for one simple reason, that these are the countries I know best in this list. I'm planning to go to Nepal for a brief visit this summer, hoping to meet some of the movers and shakers who've actually been involved in this process one way or another. But Thailand and Greece will serve us very well. And in fact, it was my first visit to Thailand in that strange sense that I had seen some of the ways in which resentment of the West was being expressed before that made me realize that the apparent resemblance was indeed rooted in some kind of historical parallel with what I had already been observing for many years in Greece. So first of all, double names. Thailand used to be called Siam, and there are plenty of people in Thailand who want to revert to the name Siam because it has less mono-ethnic implications versus Thailand. Greece has two faces, Elada, which is Hellas, the classical name. Rognosini is a reference to the Byzantine culture based, in other words, in what is now Istanbul, the new Rome. So when Greeks say we are Romyi, what they're really saying is, among ourselves, we can talk about the things we will never tell foreigners when we present ourselves as Hellenes. And by the way, this is why the Greek government repeatedly gets very angry when foreign countries call the country Greece. They want to be called the Hellenic Republic. In fact, I can show you, I have a Greek passport now, so it actually says very clearly on the inside, it says, it has of course the required letters GRC, which stands for Greece, but if you look at the name of the country, it's listed as, or the nationality is listed as Hellenic, not Greek. So, you know, that's an interesting one. Both countries have had trouble with their monarchies, and Nepal again, of course, with the whole idea of a Hindu monarchy had that. The Greek monarchy was so obviously foreign that when the military regime was overthrown, almost exactly at the same time as the Salazar-Caetano regime was overthrown here, it wasn't that difficult to get rid of the monarchy. It had been complicit with a lot of this kind of dictatorial overlordship, kowtowing to the Western power at the same time. The reason that Thailand doesn't seem to be able to get out of this pattern of slight movements in the direction of democracy and then plunging back into military rule, in part is because the military have always been able to use the monarchy as a kind of shield. So while there is a lot of conversation about whether the monarchy is actually going back to being an absolute monarchy, if it is, it's almost certain to be only a facade for military control of the country. Historically, these countries, both of them, have had to put up with sieges of national ports when the British and the French in particular wanted to interfere with, in one case, certainly that is in Greece, with the unpopularity of the monarch. In Thailand it was more about imposing tariffs and ensuring that foreign nationals, particularly British and French nationals, would not be subject to local legal sanctions, and very unequal treaties in terms of trade. Many of the other countries, China, very prominent example, suffered the same thing. Both countries treated their ethnic minorities badly. The Greeks simply refused to accept the idea that there was such a thing as an ethnic minority. Nowadays, most Greeks will tell you, at least in privacy, well, yes, we know there are minorities, but they're only 5% of the population. The fact of the matter is, Greece does recognize religious minorities, but that's only Jews and Muslims. It doesn't recognize anything else. But the idea of an ethnic minority, I think, is also confused by two factors. One, that the word ethnikos is Greek in origin, means both national and ethnic. And two, because the neighboring countries have also been very unwilling to recognize as minorities the Greek-speaking groups in those countries, Albania, for example, and Bulgaria, and so on. I've already mentioned the treatment of these sort of satellite areas, Cyprus in the Greek and Turkish case, and the further provinces in the Thai case. And the Thai that is spoken in Bangkok is very different from the Thai that's spoken in the northeast, which is, as I say, often just called Lao, and it's the language of Laos. In the south, a form of Malay is spoken by the Muslim local majority, national minority. Both countries have had to deal with street revolts and military coups, and of course, I'm sure you know that there's still a lot of demonstrations going on in the streets in Bangkok now. Very bravely, the students are taking the brunt of it again. There was a successful revolt at Thammasat University, which is the social science university of Bangkok, in 1973, and it triggered, by example, the same thing in the Polytechnic University of Athens just 1 month later, with the difference that whereas the Athens revolt was actually the trigger that in some ways led to the revolution that took advantage of the colonial stupidity in Cyprus and essentially used that opportunity to overthrow the regime on a permanent basis, Thailand slipped back 3 years later into dictatorship and never really escaped it since then. The differences, or the similarities I should say, are underscored by the ways in which these countries have been shaped. They were given cartographic definition by cartographers. That's the best and easiest way to say, okay, we've drawn a border. Now anything on the other side of the border belongs to us. Anything inside of this border you have to police, and if you don't do it rightly, we will invade. And this happened in Siam, as Thailand was then known. It also happened in the Balkans, and this wonderful title, Maps and Politics, a Review of the Ethnographic Cartography of Macedonia. It's an old book, but the author obviously had seen just how cleverly the great powers had used the idea of national borders to the Greeks and everyone else in the area around the ears with by saying, well, you're so nationalistic, it's terrible, and so on and so forth. That nationalism was created by the colonial powers. Yet the model was grown by colonialism. So just to give you some examples now to show the extraordinary duplicity of the whole system, here is the former Shah of Iran, Reza Shah Pahlavi, and in the left he's dressed in military uniform, Western style. On the right, he has adopted the costume of an early Sassanid monarch who was certainly Persian-speaking, but there's no direct line of descent between the two. This is a scene in which he crowns his consort, Queen of Iran. This is the Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. On the one side again, resplendent in Western uniform. On the right, with a completely imaginary ancient Israelite costume that, again, doesn't really have anything to do with anything local in Ethiopia, but was part of the invention of the idea that the Ethiopian kings were descended from one of the lost tribes of Judah. And in fact, Haile Selassie himself had the title, the Lion of Judah. This is an odd one. This is a former king of Denmark, George, and on the right is the national symbol of Iceland. Now, again, you're probably puzzled when I'm putting Iceland in, but notice again the play here, that there is a Viking, classic Scandinavian character, but the idea here is that our Vikings were very different from those stupid mainlanders who didn't know what they were doing. So for the Icelanders, this had a very different kind of significance, and there's a lot of very strong anti-Danish feeling in Iceland today. Still, Thailand, King Chulalongkorn Rama V, again in the same kind of Western style uniform. On the right, interestingly enough, wearing paraphernalia that are not actually Siamese. They were borrowed, along with the so-called Ratasa, the royal language, borrowed from the Khmer, the people who are the antecedents of today's Cambodians, and are still on very hostile terms with Thailand. And here is the first king of Greece, Otho, or Otto in German, who had to convert from Catholicism to Orthodoxy in order to be king. Western uniform on the left, and a supposedly traditional costume on the right, except that it was not worn by Greek speakers so much as Albanian and Slavic speakers. So once again, you see the same dynamic. Now this starts to give us a sense of what's going on here, that there's some kind of cultural legerdemain that is taking place here, through which the idea of a national independence with national traditions is being constructed out of materials that actually come from outside. Here's a perfect example. I can assure you that the Polo Club of Bangkok, and this is their emblem, it looks very Siamese somehow, but the ambience of the Polo Club is at least as good a British style as anything you'll find in Singapore or Delhi. Very much that idiom. And this is the place setting reconstructed in the palace of Princess Siridon, the sister of the present king of Thailand, as it was laid out by King Rama V, the king you just saw a picture of. So this is a reproduction, and what you notice is it's not so much a reproduction of something you would expect to see in a royal palace, although you might have, but the people who really kept to this kind of very formal layout of the crockery and cutlery in England especially were the upper bourgeoisie and the gentry. In other words, this is a very bourgeois monarchy, which might sound like a contradiction in terms, but believe me, there's plenty of evidence for it. Now, as I explained to my students just this morning, crypto-colonialism is not only about control, it's also about a certain degree of resistance on the part of the local population. So I thought I'd put this picture in. Thais usually do not now eat with chopsticks except in noodle stalls, which they regard as Chinese anyway. They use spoon and fork. But, and this is because of an edict of Rama V, again the same king, who said that the Thais don't need to use knives because the food is chopped up in the kitchen. That's actually not strictly true for every dish, but still. My hunch is that what he was trying to do was to create a distinctive way of using what are obviously Western implements, thereby demonstrating to British and French observers who regarded the Siamese as only semi-civilized that we indeed are civilized. They actually adopted the word civilized rather than talking about Aryatan. And it's very clever because, of course, then you go to Thailand and you're used to eating with a fork in one hand if you're American. If you're British, you're used to eating two-handed, but still you put your fork in the mouth, and that's not considered acceptable. And so some Americans have asked me, so how am I supposed to eat if I can't put my fork in my mouth? Well, you obey the rules of Madaya, the local rules of etiquette, and that shows you the sting in the tail, because the only way that the crypto-colonialists can fight back is in terms in which they colonize, that is culturally, rather than through any kind of military or political act. There's also a sense in which the crypto-colonies maintained a more or less spectral connection with the form of polity that predated the modern bureaucratic ethnonational state. This is a monument from Indonesia, which was a straightforward colony of the Dutch, but this was, again, pre-colonial, and it shows the typical layout of the mandala form, which is the common layout for most, I don't want to say cities, most polities in Southeast Asia, mainland and peninsula and archipelagic Southeast Asia. And this was the same layout, now adopted as a town plan for the city of Ayutthaya. Interesting enough, the Dutch cartographer who drew up this painting didn't really quite understand the sound of Ayutthaya and made it sound like Judea, right? But it is not Jerusalem or Judea, it's Ayutthaya. And this is a fresco and a column from a early 20th century hotel, which I stayed in downtown, back in the old part of Bangkok, where you can see juxtaposed a painting that shows very clearly the same circular arrangement of the city, juxtaposed with these formal classical style columns, because at this point we're also getting the need to express our civilai by having all of the accoutrements of colonial architecture. So you see an awful lot of Ionic, Corinthian, and other classical orders all in Bangkok, and that's still being done. This is a community where I did my research. This photograph is interesting for two main reasons. First, because that citadel was one of 14 citadels built when Bangkok was first set up as again, one of these mandala-shaped polities. And the idea was that it would allow the Siamese to fire guns, fire cannon, there's still some cannon there, and any French ships that tried to fire at the Siamese from the Chao-Phraya River. So over here you have the river. Now it's all completely obscured by high-rise buildings, but in those days it was a complete open space down to the river. And the second reason is, you see where the black and white stripes are at the bottom, that was the point of rupture between the old mandala polity and the modern city. In fact, if you walk up it, the ache in your thighs will tell you very quickly that there's some disconnect here. This was all done by Rama V. You see, the same guy who insisted that you had to use the broken fork. So this is actually a very interesting point where there's a sense of trying to rationalize a break with a past that still is very much revered because the dynasty is the same one and actually still ruling Thailand. Now, on the other side of the walls, the community that I studied called Pon-Mahaka, they seem to me at various times in various ways to evoke that old pre-modern polity. But the irony of what they were trying to do is, and again, I apologize for those who've already seen some of these slides before, but this is really crucial for understanding the whole crypto-colonial situation. This is a poster put out probably the late 30s by the then dictator of Thailand, Plek Songkham. And the top line in large letters simply says Watanatam Thai culture. So you will all see, of course, the picture on the left is a picture of Thais, and it's contrasted with Westerners on the right. But you're wrong. It's on the left it says, don't do this, and on the right it says, this is how you should behave. So to be really Thai, you actually have to be as un-Siamese as possible. And so the whole trick here was that the Siamese were being inculcated into the idea that the ultimate attainment of civilization was to look like the West, while actually claiming a distinctive identity. And this continues to this day. So as part of the justification of the destruction of the community that I was studying there, this is a poster that shows how they imagined the space to be once they kicked the inhabitants out and destroyed the houses. And if you look at the images, you see the same logic being represented. These are supposed to be Thai people. I think I don't have to add any comments to the pictures to make my point. I'm sure it's a Gucci bag that the woman in the black pants is searching at on the upper level. Now, back to Greece, and we'll see some of the same logics apply. So the West pretended to react with horror when they first saw Greece as an independent state, that people were still dressing in what they thought of as Turkish or Ottoman costume, and that the ancient monuments were all mixed up with Islamic mosques, which were seen as a mark of a lack of civilization. I mean, the monstrosity of colonial prejudice is something that I think as soon as you start to think about it, you realize its global extensions are appalling, and because they are so commonplace, we often don't even notice them. So this may seem like this is actually a famous French painter, Delacroix. It's a scene of the arrival of King Otho being greeted, of course, in front of the Parthenon, because we had to establish some sort of connection between this young German prince who really didn't know much about anything Greek and the ancient past, because all justification for letting Greece be an independent country was that this was the rebirth of the Greek people. King Otho wanted his palace to be placed right in the Acropolis, and these designs were actually drawn up by German and Danish architects, showing, as you can see on one end, to the left of these two diagrams, a life-size reproduction of the famous ancient statue by the Athenian sculptor Phidias of the goddess Pallas Athene. The church started to get very nervous at this point because they didn't want all this pagan stuff to be paraded around. And this was the beginning of the evidence that there wasn't actually quite such a good fit here either. So some of what you were seeing in the Thai case is happening here in Greece as well. This lack of fit between two models, two different views of what the essence of the should be. This is another view of the same thing. This is the University of Athens. You see again this evocation of the classical past here in the country that's associated with it. The Erechtheum and even private houses. This is one from the Piraeus, no longer in existence as far as I know, but you had your own little Acropolis. And the facades, and this is what's important, the facades were often very neoclassical. Inside you would get an arrangement that was much more Romaic, was much more typical of the ordinary village culture, not only of Greeks, but of the people all around the Balkans. And this continues to this day. This is actually a hairdressing salon on the island of Crete. I put it in because you can see the same logic all over again. You can see the classical style architrave at the top, the classical statue in the bottom right, and notice that it's white because that's going to be focus of something I'm going to say in a moment. So that's just to make sure you understand that this is really about ancient Greece. Then in French, coiffure, to make sure you understand that this means we are really European. because to be European was to trace your lineage back to ancient Greece as it was imagined. And this imagination was given very free play even as recently as the 2004 Olympic Games. Here is a 6th century Kouros, a statue of a upstanding young man. Sorry, once again. This was a live performance at the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games in 2004. So these Kouroi came to life. But suddenly, we see that they are also figuring in protest movements. So then we started to see that when there were protests in the street, people actually took pieces of marble off the facades of some of these neoclassical 19th century buildings and started hurling them at the police. This was a very clear expression that they had understood that this neoclassical architectural style was part of a structure of oppression. And I should mention that this was, I got this from an article by an archaeologist. Archaeologists in the 19th century, along with folklorists, had been the architects of the construction of the nationalist ideology. Now, in the post-dictatorship years, it's the archaeologists, in many ways, who are leading the critique of this and exposing, and this particular author, Dimitrios Plantos, has also made extensive use of the notion of crypto-colonialism. Where did this all come from? Well, the image we have of classical Greek art, and especially sculpture, was really invented by a man by the name of Winkelmann, Johann Winkelmann, who never actually went to Greece. He apparently died in a bar brawl in the Italian town of Ancona when he was about to embark on his first voyage to Greece. So he was spared the embarrassment of discovering how wrong he was. And he imagined that all ancient Greeks looked like the Roman copies of ancient Greek statues. So this is, again, this is an extraordinary story of multiple layers of deception. And it wasn't until a very few years ago that an exhibit in Athens for the first time revealed the appalling fact to the racist segments of the population that the Greek statues were painted in pigments and the skin colors were at least olive colored, if not darker. So this was a major shift away from the Aryanist hypothesis, which was staunchly supported by serious classical scholars. I mean, people that when Martin Bernal published a famous book called Black Athena, trying to trace a lot of aspects of ancient Greek culture back to ancient Egypt and to Nubia, and therefore to black people, Greek conservatives were outraged. How can you say that we are Africans? As if there was something bad about this. And that was part of the same reaction that I think had prevented any revelation of the pigmentation of these statues, because they preferred to imagine the ancient Greeks as lily white representatives of the non-existent Aryan race. Here is Dimitrios Plantos. I couldn't resist an ironic photo, so there he is with a statue looking rather like him, when you think that until fairly recently photographs like this would have been taken as racial evidence of continuity. Well, you know what I think of that, but it was a nice moment to capture, because he would agree with me that this was absolute nonsense, and if there's any resemblance at all, it's the intellectual frown. That's okay. And again, copies of ancient statues, which are frequent around Athens, now become the focus of ironic rethinking, as you see here, this statue of a helot, of an ancient Greek Athenian soldier, if he's now about to shoot someone with a champagne bottle. And in the background, again, all of this history of domination by a German tradition of history, philology, and archaeology, instrumentalized by British and French colonial interests, comes the European Union with its economic policies that eventually, under the direction of then Finance Minister Schäuble, I think led to extraordinary suffering in Greece through the application of austerity. The Greeks were criticized in the German press, which tended to follow the government line as being degenerate and being corrupt. And I publicly argued that charge of corruption is particularly interesting because the four major corruption scandals in Greece involved, respectively, the blaming of Greek officials by Daimler Corporation, by Siemens Corporation twice, and by the Deutsche Bahn, which is after all part of the German government system, which bribed Greek government officials to allow them to construct the road from the airport to the Olympic Village, very profitable venture. So, where does the corruption come from? And why are we talking about it at all? I'm not trying to say for a moment that the Germans are corrupt. I'm not going to be racist about the Germans, even if some Germans have been racist about Greece. I don't think we should be playing that game. But we do need to see that very specific financial interests played with fundamentally racist and colonialist ideas to bully Greece into a position of total subjection. And it's only really in the last 2 or 3 years that we've seen Greece beginning to bounce back. And even now, they're doing it more on the terms of the IMF and the EU that I think is really good for them. And the reality was pretty quickly understood. People are not stupid. They realize that the financial future of the country was now in the hands again of foreign countries, if indeed it had ever not been. And hence this nice graffito where somebody has crossed out Greece and something that says Bank of Greece, and made sure that we see what it is by filling in the N and the K of bank, and they were painted back and both in, so we know exactly who's doing what. And they also recognized, of course, that they were local agents of this kind of thing. So this placard says, no house in the hands of bankers, because they saw that the Greek banks themselves had become complicit in this system of domination. I want to say something more general, though, about this, because it's not just the bankers who were involved in this process. For crypto-colonialism to work, you always had to have a local elite that became and this is why it's always conservative, because they don't want people questioning the degree to which they are subjecting the country to foreign control. So there's an important question. Are these elites, as I'm implying here, cultural quislings, or are they groups that led their countries safely away from being actually invaded by some foreign power? Well, it's pretty clear what these people thought. They actually were breaking down the front doors of the agricultural bank of Greece. I happened to come out of the metro stop right next to this, and of course couldn't resist getting my camera out. They were much too interested in what they were doing to notice the tear gas all over the place. It was quite an experience. My eyes were smarting. I was coughing for a week afterwards. But, you know, it seemed to me to express the growing awareness and growing impatience with the kind of straitjacket public silence that had been typical up to now. In Thailand, the protest is much more dangerous. I mean, we've already seen people being killed as the army responded with gunfire. Now, before I go to some more general conclusions, I'd like to mention some of the outlying cases, because to understand this model, I think it's really important to see that it is not a taxonomic model. This is not about classifying some groups one way and some groups another way. It's trying, as I said at the beginning of this talk, to ask, what do we really learn by putting these different countries in a box together? And so I thought, let's put the more extreme examples in and see why that becomes interesting. Well, first of all, China. Now, China actually is not that much of an outlier because it had to deal with foreign domination, so-called foreign concessions in Shanghai, the establishment of the beer industry in Qingdao, which was totally under German control again, interestingly enough, humiliating trade treaties with the French and the British, and a civilizational discourse that, on the one hand, was defensive, so that the more the Chinese start talking about how we are as civilized as the West, the more they seem to be pulling tight the ropes that make them look dependent on the West, but also using that same discourse to express their disdain for their own minorities, even as they seek to prove that those minorities are really Chinese. But the contradictions are really quite consistent. of course, again, this problem of boundaries I've already mentioned. The case of Iceland is interesting because the myth, of course, was that Denmark and Iceland were two independent countries. They just happened to have the same king, and it just so happened that the king was an absolute monarch, so he appointed the ministers for both countries, and the ministers for Denmark were Danes, and guess what? The ministers for Iceland were also Danes. So I think that speaks for itself. What's interesting is that the economic crash that came in Iceland came almost exactly the same time as it happened in Greece and in Thailand. So there's something global about what's going on here. I don't want to overstate that connection, but it does seem to me that it's not just coincidental. Afghanistan is more of an outlier, and I go every which way about whether I should include Afghanistan or not, but there certainly is a concern with borders. The difference is that there never has been a central ethnic group that has been able to take over the country with sufficient consistency. There are many different ethnic groups. Of course, the Pashtun are the ones who hold the upper hand in terms of public discourses, but the Taliban actually incorporate people from a number of different ethnic groups, so they may be the ones who eventually unify the country. And as we see happening now in India, a genuine post-colony, if there is one, what we're seeing is that religion can also become a focus of something that looks like an ethno-national identity. So the Hindutva ideology of Prime Minister Modi's political party is very much that to be truly Indian, you have to be Hindu, you have to be Hindi-speaking as well, so there's also problems about dealing with the speakers of southern Indian languages. Excuse me. So, I'm getting through this quite quickly. I think that will give us plenty of time for discussion. Let me visit a few key points here that might draw these disparate elements together. First of all, what's the practical difference? What do we gain, again, by creating a heuristic model? Because this is what this model is. It's not an attempt to say, we can put things in boxes and sort them out that way. It is something that allows us, it points us in the direction of new understandings. It does seem to me that what this does, above all else, is to show how the miasma of colonialism spread much further than the red blotches on the globe admit. The Western powers have been very careful, I think, especially in recent years, to show colonialism as something that, yes, it took place, it took part, and it was in very constricted boundaries, even if they were already a very substantial part of the globe's territory. Once you add the crypto colonies, you add a lot more territory. And if you also add countries like Palestine, as Palestinian mandate under the British, if you add, here's an interesting one, not the British, but the English control over the Irish, Scots, and Welsh, which may be about to explode. These are all variants of these kinds of indirect occupation. And of course, there is the well-known British method of what's called indirect rule. And you might think that crypto-colonialism is a form of indirect rule. I would say that the important difference is what I'm calling crypto-colonialism uses as its primary means of domination the definition of culture. It produce the national cultures and then push the groups of people into extreme forms of nationalism, which are then used to describe them as irresponsible members of the global community. This is a very consistent pattern. It seems to me across virtually all of the countries I've been talking about. Second point is the persistence of historical patterns. I mentioned the German involvement in the promotion of the Aryan myth and the way this has affected Greece. But you can find very similar arguments pushed forward by English Sanskritists in the case of Iran, for instance. You can find, again, German thinkers behind a lot, and also Swiss thinkers behind a lot of what became pretty much political doctrine in other terms Turkey, also a very powerfully Western imitating crypto-colony. So these historical patterns are deep, but I want to keep for the moment anyway, to keep the term crypto-colonialism for those parts of the world that were affected in this way, specifically by the Western European powers, and not, for example, include the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire had a totally different structure in which ethnic identity was never much of an issue. Religious identity was, but ethnic identity didn't make much of a difference. And in fact, many of the military leaders and bureaucrats of the Ottoman Empire were Greek speakers and Armenian speakers. So clearly, we're talking about a very different kind of entity. Now, one question that's often raised when I present this material is, well, what about the Soviet Union and its satellites? Isn't that a case of crypto-colonialism? I would answer, you can either call it a real case of colonialism, and therefore these various countries that we see now in Russia's response to Ukraine, perhaps, that this is the empire fights back, right? That these are countries that have been colonized. There's nothing crypto about it, except in name. And it seems to me that the only civilizational discourse that was involved was the idea of the Marxist model, which is a perversion anyway of what Marx himself said. So I don't think it fits very well. I'm going to mention it. I'm now writing a book about crypto-colonialism, and I'm certainly going to bring this up. But it seems to me that that's a bit of a wild goose chase. If somebody can use crypto-colonialism to show that there was something very similar going on, so much the better. If this, again, I don't have a monopoly over the use of the term, even if I coined it, but I also feel that for my own purposes it's more interesting to try to control it a little bit, keep it within these bounds. Now, one very interesting question that I think concerns all the countries I've talked about is local agency. So people have said to me, look, you know, when you talk about crypto-colonialism, you are essentially saying that these countries had no agency of their own. What they're overlooking, and by the way, often very conservative commentators who make those kinds of comments, including one philosopher who attacked me in the Greek press for precisely this. My response is very simple. You're saying this because you don't want us to realize what your class was doing and is still doing by keeping your country under the thumb of the Western powers. That actually your agency has been very important. You can make the case that you are saviors of your country because with that kind of relationship with the colonial powers, they didn't see any necessity to invade. Or, if you're more left-wing persuasion, as I discovered from the people who supported me in this argument, you're more likely to find these people described as cultural quizlings in one way or another. Well, I don't want to do more than three very strong hints of what I think, partly because I want to go on being able to work in places like Thailand. In Greece, I can say these things. You know, some people get annoyed with me, but it's a very open democracy now, even though the government at the moment is quite conservative. That is another important difference among the crypto-colonists, that they had very different trajectories. Greece and Nepal are probably the most successful examples of getting out of the crypto-colonial orbit, but it's very recent, and there's still a danger that they could fall back because their establishments, their more conservative establishment figures, have every interest in trying to pull them back. But I think on the whole it's not happening. Thailand, China, no, interesting to put a supposedly right-wing dictatorship with a supposedly Marxist state in the same box, but they both seem to be unable to move to a more democratic system. And surely China's response to Hong Kong and Taiwan both is a fear that democracy actually might deprive the current leadership of its privileged position in China. Now, there have been critiques of the notion. The first thing that happened was people said nobody's going to use this term because we already have semi-colonialism. There was some very negative. I first wrote about it in 2002, and the first reactions were basically, well, it's a nice idea, but we already have a terminology to deal with it. That didn't last very long because, for the reasons I gave you, I think people understood very quickly that one could move beyond that. From the critiques that I've experienced, particularly in Greece, I would say that what we can also see is the persistence of crypto-colonial ideas, that many of those critiques actually confirm the power of the model, because they show you how determined certain elements are to maintain their role as privileged agents of a foreign cultural domination. The political and cultural consequences of crypto-colonialism today also vary from country to country. This is a comparative project. I don't expect it to be the same. Their impact also on everyday life will vary from country to country. But in all cases, what you see is that there is some play of a civilizational discourse that is being held up as a way of emulating the West, that modernity lies precisely in emulating the West, and that those who fail to do so are somehow less patriotic or simply less good examples of the national identity. So that's the end of the slideshow, and I just want to add a couple of comments before we go into the discussion. Again, most of all, I want to emphasize this is not a taxonomic game. So if you're going to ask me, but such and such a country doesn't fit, I'm just not going to answer, because you may be right in some sense. But if you ask me, what do we actually gain in this or that case, those are the interesting questions. And I think that it is a useful concept because precisely the semi-colonial and neo-colonial terms didn't really generate much discussion about the role of local elites. And that's precisely where the question of agency plays out in its most complex form. Not all members of elites were willing to act as agents of these foreign interventions. Some of them became critics, and they became critics more easily, of course, as the foreign-supported authoritarian regimes weakened. So Greece is a very good example of that, and the extraordinary transformation of archaeology from an absolute orthodoxy to a place of contested ideologies is fascinating and really wonderful to see, because it means that people are now consciously understanding that the representation of the ancient past is itself a matter of ideological construction. Another point that I think is worth emphasizing is that there are certain to be questions about these, again, these similar kinds of patterns. The British model of indirect rule, the Soviet satellite, and so on. I believe that the plurality of possibilities that this model opens up, and the possibility of further comparisons that take different types of colonialism and think about why they look different is valuable. And the other thing is that it transcends an important an important disciplinary divide, the divide between history and anthropology. This is a project that speaks both to the role of cultural identity and the way it is shaped, which is an anthropological issue by and large, and the processes through which this happened over time, which is a historical question. Cultural, social anthropology and history have never been far apart from each other. In many ways, they are two dimensions of the same discipline. I think they're much closer together, for example, than social anthropology and sociology in many cases. This model allows us to think about diachronic processes that nonetheless lead to the production of synchronic models, of very rigid models of cultural identity, and to ask why these models of cultural identity are so important, and why, especially, political leaderships invest so much in maintaining them. So I'll leave it there and open it up. Thank you very much. So, Javier.
Thank you very much, Michael. We have a few minutes for discussion. I just want to remind the audience that the event is being recorded for dissemination, virtual dissemination, so you should be aware of that if you want to intervene. Before we gather questions, I just want to do a brief comment. I think this is, a very important contribution to the discussion on colonialism and how to think about colonialism and its legacies, because precisely it focuses on the colonial rationality of government as a continuum. It's not about reproducing what is precisely the colonial conception of a kind of global hierarchy of states. So I thought this was very powerful. Also the way in which you address, the different scales of this colonial rationality of government, from the city to the body, to, the act of being. And also, I think another very important aspect for me was finding out the internal disjunctions of these polities. This junction between a privileged perspective on what development is and on, the future social space versus the actual situated practices of less privileged classes, which were more plural, let's say, in contrast to the desire of a innate that the privileged classes imagined. And I think for the students it would be very interesting to put this work in dialogue with some other, with the work of some other anthropologists that I think talk well with this work on crypto-colonialism. I was reminded, for example, of James Ferguson's work on, the ideas about modernity in Zambia. I think also Iowa Ong's work on worlding, between, this is about a more contemporary moment, but between polities and around the Indian Ocean, and also this issue of this internal disjunctions of these polities is very much reminded. He's not an anthropologist, but it's partly a work with an ethnographic perspective. Timothy Mitchell's work on the role of the more privileged classes in Egypt, after territorial occupation, so after the independence of Egypt and a moment of post-independence development. I think it's a really, fascinating contribution. Who has questions for Professor Herzfeld? Mal.
Hi. Thank you for a very enlightening conversation and presentation. So I'm a PhD student with Professor Tiago, and I'm working on a similar case in Goa, in India. And my question to you is, because I was also laboring under this whole understanding of the idea of what the colonials have seeded the local elites with, and that is a kind of, they have imbibed that whole spirit of modernity, what is modern, and the aspirations towards copying that form in a way. But I had thought that this was a form of, I could be wrong because I'm an architect, I'm not an anthropologist, a form of cosmopolitanism. I don't know, you could.
The form of?
Cosmopolitanism.
Yeah, okay.
Right? So now what my question is that if that is also cosmopolitanism, because there is literature available from 19th century Indian, from current historians on 19th century cosmopolitanism in Mughal courts, with the Mughals being cosmopolitan about, because they were introduced to the Western cultures, and also the Marathas, coming back to Western India. So the whole idea is that if the elite, and mostly it is the elite who command the construction of buildings, let us say, or the construction of an identity, whether it's national or local. If they are themselves seated with this whole thing, so is that, my basic question is it cosmopolitanism, or as you have framed it to be colonialism?
Well, I think, thank you. It's a very interesting and very rich question. India, of course, is in so many ways the quintessential post-colony, right? So, but I would certainly not say that the post-colonies have nothing in common with the crypto-colonies. On the contrary, they have many things in common. The big difference is the denial. India has never denied that it could be colonized. The Thais spent a lot of energy telling everybody else that they were never under colonialism. That's a really significant difference. And so what that does is take attention away from discourses like the discourse of cosmopolitanism that are actually wielded by the elite as ways of enforcing their authority. But there are different kinds of elites. So if you take the case of India, I mean, think of the difference between, for example, the princely families like in Hyderabad and so on the one hand, and the Parsis on the other. The princely families, who ought to have been much more out of sync with the new India, were nonetheless absorbed very much into it, and some of them maintained the titles for quite a long time, and they still, some of them have, at least a symbolic following, not unlike that of some aristocrats in Portugal, I might add. But on the other hand, the Parsis, because they were not Hindu, and they were essentially Iranian speakers, they were Zoroastrians from Iran, were seen as somehow having colluded much more with the British and were totally marginalized. And by the way, there's a very interesting way in which that's reflected in Indian restaurants in England. As you know, that the Parsi dishes all ended up there because somehow that was empire, right? So the Indian case is rich because it's complex. It's a huge country with many variations, but at the same time, what does seem to bind it all together is a common sense of complaint about the colonial past, and the ones who do most of the complaining are, of course, members of the elite who were themselves very often complicit, but also were among the classes that led the resistance to it. So, the other thing about cosmopolitanism, Ajahn Appadurai's work has been very much criticized on the grounds that it is an elite kind of cosmopolitanism, because the migrants who come, for example, from all over the world here or to Greece are also cosmopolitans, but in a different way. It's a different idiom, but in fact they have the same kind of complex knowledge of cultural difference. So the claim to cosmopolitanism may actually be little more than a reflection of some, again, Western-inspired notion of high culture. And I think Appadurai in particular, I think, missed that in his early work on cosmopolitanism. And now people like Nicholas de Genova, especially pointing out that migrants are extraordinarily cosmopolitan. So it becomes now more of an analytical term and less of an ideological claim. So your question triggers all sorts, as you can see from my answer, all sorts of very rich possibilities. But I think that shows also why it's useful not to put India and, say, Thailand in the same box. Because, again, the denial in Thailand that they were colonized means that the myth of also the independent emergence of Thai culture continues to be uncriticized, undiscussed. And in fact, there's a recent article, I just came across it for the first time yesterday, by David Streckfus, in which he points out that the whole idea that the Lao are somehow a different group than the Thais was something that was created by the central Thai elite as a way of, again, creating a structure of domination within the country. Yes, you can point to similar things going on in India, but in India they'll always tell you, well, that's really just a remnant of the old colonial structure, right, of hierarchies. Even to the point where, say, Nicholas Dirks has argued that the caste system is only rigid because the British made it so. So,
yeah.
The Thais can't make those kinds of arguments.
Comparison between Thailand and India is in any way not compatible, primarily because of the, of the kinds of different or varied cultures which India, by itself as a geographical bound, it had. And Thailand being a much smaller country, probably more, ethnically closer to I mean, India was heterogeneous and it was not. I don't know. Maybe that
one of the interesting, one of the most interesting things I read in the anthropology of India is a short article in an American ethnologist by Gloria Goodwin-Rahija, who points out that the British employed folklorists to make compendia of proverbs which they would then use to create a hierarchy of different ethnic groups and also different castes. So this kind of intervention was going on, and of course you could point to similar processes in Greece for sure. I've actually written a bit about that, but it's you know, when it's being done by a visibly colonial bureaucracy, it is much more effective, and you see these, again, kinds of shapings taking place in the texts, which then correspond to what suddenly become facts on the ground, which are not facts 50 years earlier. The idea that some castes, for example, especially some ethnic groups, were somehow closer to the Western ideals of civilization than others.
Most are. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Such a silence. Sorry, Fred. Too much in one hour or something. I mean, you know, there's no such thing as a dumb question, so just, you know, whatever you feel like. If it wasn't clear, and if you want to contest or even agree with, you're allowed to do that. Yes, please.
Maybe I'll ask a question, but probably didn't understand this concept is applicable inside the same country. So, for example, I was thinking about the case of Catalonia in Spain, or there are many others like Scotland. So this is applicable to this case?
I don't think so. Well, let me put it this way. You can try to apply it, and that's what I'm really trying to encourage you to do. You know, what happens if we think of these as crypto-colonial? I would say that the case of Catalonia is much more a case of actual colonialism in a historical sense, because it was the expansion of the Castilian monarchy that brought Catalonia under so-called Spanish rule, right? It's very much like the case of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales being brought under English domination, and the current move for Scottish independence is explicitly anti-colonial. The discourse is framed as anti-colonial. Certainly the discourse in Northern Ireland, it's interesting, there's some evidence that the Catholics and Protestants who were represented in the English press as being radically opposed to each other were actually colluding in fighting against the British troops, because both, and that's only part of the truth, that both groups were very aware that their current situation was the result of colonial misrule, and they called it that. And of course, the Catholic faction called it that more openly, but I think many analysts, my late colleague, Begonia Arechaga, who's herself Basque, and she was talking about the situation in Northern Ireland. She said it's clear that they use Ireland in a way as a practice zone for the colonialism that was then exported later. So I think rather than calling it crypto-colonialism, maybe we should call these cases like Catalonia, like Ireland, we should call them occluded colonialism, or even historically neglected colonialism, something like that. You know, we could create a term that makes explicit that difference, because nowadays, if an Irish person says to another Irish person, we were victims of colonialism, I don't think you'd get very much of an argument. And it's certainly true from what I hear in Catalonia. So I think it's useful to make that distinction. But again, what's interesting, and what's interesting about your question, is that you raised a possible new way of looking at these things. Why not? You know, I don't want to be so wedded to one way of operating this terminology that then it becomes a kind of intellectual dictatorship.
Another thing that I was thinking related to archaeology, I was thinking about when the Islamic State destroyed some archaeological.
I'm sorry.
When, like, I think it was 2014-15, the Islamic State in Syria destroyed some archaeological sites. That I remember it was a real scandal, at least here in Europe, because we are really I don't know, it was like the destruction of part of the ancient history of Syria. And I don't know, it would be And I would be curious to hear from Syrian people how they experienced this loss, if it was a loss or if it was not.
Right. Well, this is, the invocation of an ancient past is one of the ways in which colonial rule can be disguised, can be made cryptic, right? So Greece is an obvious example, but so is Iran. I mean, the sudden upsurge of archaeological and historical activity around the Achaemenid period under the last Shah is exactly a case of that. And of course you get it in the post-colonies as well. So for instance, and it gets contested. So you take something like the Babri Ayodhya dispute in India, are you going to call it the Babri Mosque, or are we going to call it the Hindu temple of the Ayodhya? That's a question of which history you're going to promote. Of course, that's also true even in the most independent countries, right? That the different factions are going to have different readings of history and competition with each other. But it's when it gets caught up in the, again, we're back to hierarchy, the hierarchizing tendencies of colonial rule that I think we start to see some of these connections clearer.
One last question?
I remember when you
I'm sorry, I'm very hard of hearing, so I'm going to have to ask you
I will try
to shout a little bit.
to.
And you can yell at me, that's okay.
When you refer Arjuna Pagrai, yes?
To?
Arjuna Pagrai,
Yes.
I remember in modernity at large, in modernity at large,
Yes, that's an important argument.
he asks about the place of national states in global movements, transnational movements, and how you think crypto-colonialism in responding to Pagrai and transnationalism.
So, I think that there is a connection in the sense, his thesis that small groups somehow become the targets of much more violent repression, right? It's certainly true in the crypto-colonies, but it was also true in the post-colonies, or in the colonial era even. I think the problem is a slightly different one, and that is that as the controls from outside loosen, these countries strive to achieve the impression of being a unified country, unified around a single ethnic identity. And so these little groups become seriously inconvenient. And I think that, that's true. It's certainly true for countries like Thailand and Greece. Greece has dealt with it a little differently in the sense that Greeks generally now will tell you, of course we have ethnic minorities, that's just nonsense, but we have to keep this up because the neighboring countries will take advantage. The minute we say we have a Turkish minority, the Turks will invade. The minute we, and this is an old story. I don't think it's going to last much longer because, frankly, a lot of Greeks are laughing at it now. That's not true in Thailand because the dominant rhetoric is of a monarchy and an elite that are ethnically singular. So all these other groups are somehow less Thai and therefore can be relegated to lower position. In fact, I was in my class this morning, I was talking about the role of the ideology of karma, that somehow they deserve to be lower in the system because they obviously must have done something bad in another time. In fact, the term for people of elite status is hudi, which means literally good people. It's a moral evaluation. It's just like, Weber's notion of the Protestant ethic, that these are people who deserve to be prosperous because after all they are prosperous. Therefore they must have deserved it. A completely circular argument. And that sort of argument is used then to coagulate the ethnic majority. Nobody's talking about the fact that the royal family, for example, is partly of Chinese origin. Everybody knows that. And for many, many years, the Chinese were themselves discriminated against in Thailand. They were more successfully integrated than in many of the other Southeast Asian countries, for example, Vietnam and Indonesia. But there was certainly a sense, and they still stand out as different because they have longer names. This is where they try to be more Thai than the Thais. So that's why so many of them have 6-syllable surnames. But the thing is that the very necessity of doing that shows you that as a minority, because of course the Chinese were a minority ethnically speaking, they constituted something dangerous to the idea of a whole a unity. Now, why did that change? Partly it changed because they were very, as an ethnic group as a whole, they were very successful in commerce, and they began to bankroll the country's prosperity, such as it was. Another reason is that they tend to have lighter skins than ethnic Thais. There was a very strong element of Western imported racism in this. You'll see Thai people who have a dark complected, rubbing ointment into their face, creams that will make them whiter, as you do in many parts of Southeast Asia and elsewhere. But the Chinese are considered to look more European than the ethnic Thai because the skin is lighter. So now the ideal type of the ethnic Thai is looking more like somebody Chinese. It's the same logic that we saw in that poster of Thai culture. In other words, you try to look like something, as it were, to the west of you, and this then eliminates the danger that might otherwise accrue from having small minorities that actually challenge the myth of ethnic homogeneity. So I think, Panerai was right to point out that small numbers made for really major points of friction. But I think in the crypto-colonial case, you also see those small numbers as having a certain kind of dynamic in which the minority sometimes actually achieves enormous power by itself becoming a key part of the majority. And the Chinese origins of the Thai royal family, which of course, again, if I'm giving this lecture in Thailand, I wouldn't be saying a word of this, because they have a very, very draconian lèse-majesté laws. But that dynamic is itself part of the problem. So, thank you for that. I mean, I want to think about that connection with Panerai's argument some more. I think it is an important connection.
Well, I think we sadly have to conclude for today, but I want to remind everyone that we have the opportunity to continue this conversation on the 3rd of May next week. There's going to be one final lecture by Professor Herzfeld devoted to the topic urban ethnography and accidental activism. So it's going to be on Tuesday here in this room at the same time from 5:30 p.m. to 7 p.m. So I encourage you all to come back and we can continue this fascinating conversation, although the topic will be completely different.